God eftermiddag alla deltagare, ni som är med via länk och ni som är med på plats här i Granö i Västerbotten. Jag heter Malin von Essen och kommer att vara dagens moderator. Och jag är jätteglad över att vara här i Granö idag. Alltså vi har ett superintressant program. Vi befinner oss på en plats, en strålande vacker, i ett strålande vackert västerbottniskt försommarlandskap. Det var det jag skulle säga. Och dessutom så har vi ett väder som man verkligen inte kan klaga på. Vårt program kommer att börja med ett globalt perspektiv på dagens tema som ju handlar om biokrediter som verktyg för företag som vill bidra finansiellt till åtgärder som är positiva för biologisk mångfald. Och från det globala tar vi oss sedan närmare och närmare de platser i den svenska skogen och hos de svenska skogsägarna där biokrediterna skapas. Vi kommer att avsluta hybridkonferensen med ett samtal där några skogsägare som har biokrediter att erbjuda marknaden kommer att resonera kring sina drivkrafter och varför de väljer att satsa på biokrediter. Ni som finns med via länk har möjlighet att ställa frågor och då använder ni frågefunktionen i den här konferensplattformen som ni ser sändningen i. Och sen kan det vara så att vi inte hinner ta upp alla frågor och då kommer de att besvaras i efterhand och mejlas ut till er. Vi har ett par programändringar. Martin Pilstjärna kommer att ersätta Alessandra Holmlund som ju forskar på biokrediter på SLU. Hon har fått förhinder och det var kungen som kom emellan. Vi får väl säga att hon har giltigt förfall, även om vi gärna hade velat ha Alessandra med oss här idag. Hon ska för övrigt prata om biodiversitet. Ett tillägg i programmet är att Adam Al-Jaraida från Trebula, tidigare Virkesbörsen, han ska berätta om den roll som Trebula kommer att spela som teknikpartner till Karlbo på marknaden för biokrediter framöver. Ni får veta mer om detta då. Och den programpunkten kommer då precis efter den programpunkt som Alexandra skulle ha hållit och som nu Martin Pilstjärna håller i hennes ställe. Och det hela innebär att hybridseminariet blir 10 minuter längre än vad som stod i det ursprungliga programmet. Så det slutar 15:40 som senast. Jag ska också nämna att seminariet kommer att spelas in. Och med det sagt så sätter vi igång och jag byter då till engelska för den första programpunkten. It's with great pleasure that I now introduce our keynote speaker, Alessandro Valentini, who is very experienced in sustainable development finance, international affairs, and public-private collaboration. He is a sustainable finance specialist at the World Economic Forum. And in the past 2 years, he has been leading the start and the development of the World Economic Forum's work on biodiversity, credit markets, as an instrument to scale investments towards a net zero, nature-positive and socially equitable future. Alessandro will provide us with a global perspective on how biodiversity credits can finance nature-positive outcomes. Alessandro Valentini, most welcome to World Forest Forum 2024. And now the virtual scene is yours.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Malin. It's great to be part of the event. Thanks for inviting me. I'm very sorry I'm not able to be in what seems to be a fantastic location with a fantastic weather. But I love to be part of these events. In terms of introduction, you introduced me. Thanks for that, Malin. I sit in the Center for Nature and Climate at the World Economic Forum. I've been there in the past 2 years working on understanding how we can mobilize more investments for nature. And so I think it's a fantastic moment to have the World Forest Forum and these kind of events. And it's not surprising to see that these events are popping up more and more. Everyone is more interested in nature than before. The momentum around nature is incredible, and we clearly know why. The data is very speaking clearly, and we have more and more data that is telling us what to do and what is the right direction we need to take. So first of all, we know that we are entirely dependent on nature. Our GDP, our whole economy is entirely dependent on the biosphere. 44 trillion US dollar are moderately or highly dependent on nature, but all of our system, all of our economy is actually depending on nature, and we need to do something about it. We cannot just let it disappear. We also know from, for example, the global risk report of the World Economic Forum, that the biggest risks that companies, investors see, the long-term risks in particular, are environmentally related. As you can see from this picture, extreme weather events, critical change to Earth system, biodiversity loss and economic collapse, and nature resource shortages are the biggest concern for business and investors in the long run. And I can tell you that these environmental risks have been in this long run for a few years now, meaning that we are getting close to the long run as we speak. At the same time, we know that we are losing nature. The WWF tells that 69% of the wildlife population has been declining in the past 50 years alone. We know that 20% of forested areas have been lost, 50% of coral reefs also due to climate change, etc. So we know that nature is declining at an unprecedented rate. Insects, just to make an example, are even declining at higher rates than the rest of wildlife population. And we know clearly when we look at pollinators, for example, the role that they play into our ecosystems and into our economy in terms of ecosystem services and nature contribution to people that they provide. So if we combine these three elements, if we combine the risks, the dependencies, and the loss of biodiversity, we have a pretty dire picture in terms of where we're going with our economic situation. And a lot of resources will have to be put and spent in fixing a situation which, if we act now, we can actually prevent. So we can decide not to ignore what the clear data is telling us and act now. And the good news is that we know what are the main drivers of biodiversity loss. We know where to act. They are, for example, the land and use, and sea use change, and climate change, pollution, exploitation of natural resources, invasive species. All of these drivers are basically the biggest biodiversity loss that we are seeing, and we need to act on those. And we need to use all the instruments that we have in our toolbox to fight against this crisis. 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, in Montreal, in December 22, the Global Biodiversity Framework gave us the North Star, gave us all the information we need, gave us the right direction that we need to embrace to change this, go toward another trajectory. And we know that of the $700 billion financing gap for biodiversity, that to bridge the gap, to stop and reverse nature loss, there is a number of things we need to do. On the public sector side, we need to change harmful subsidies. We need to reform some of the subsidies that are going to harm nature rather than actually providing support to nature. From the private sector side, we need to mobilize more finance. We know that we are not doing enough in terms of in investing in nature, in safeguarding nature. And one of the instruments that the Article 19 of the Global Biodiversity Frameworks is providing us and is mentioning are biodiversity credits. And I want to be already clear now that biodiversity credits are just one of the many instruments that the GBF is telling us. More than half of that financing gap, so more than 350 billion US dollar annually, must be spent, for example, in reforming those subsidies. But then we need to go beyond that. We need to invest in nature. We need to mobilize more finance, and this is where instruments like biodiversity credits can support, and can be one of the many tools in the toolbox that we can use. So, what are biodiversity credits? Just last week, there was a definition coming from the Biodiversity Credits Alliance, which is a great news for people that have been in this space in the past 2 years. And we know that the definition is telling us a number of elements. So they are a certificate that represent a measure, an evidence-based unit of positive biodiversity outcome that is durable and additional to what would have otherwise occurred. So we know now that it has to be measured, it must be evidence-based, durable, and additional. So it's great to see now a definition coming on biodiversity credits. What this definition and this paper doesn't tell us, though, it's what biodiversity credits are not. And as mentioned, I don't think biodiversity credits are the panacea for the biodiversity loss crisis. We need to look at biodiversity credits into these broader context and into the broader picture and processes of transitioning toward a more nature-positive economy and economic system. Biodiversity credits need to be put and need to feed into sustainability strategies, nature strategy. They need to follow a clear mitigation hierarchy. So they need to contribute to this positive economic system and not be seen as the final solution for the biodiversity loss crisis. So let's look at credits as a broader into the broader picture of transforming business models. We know that there are a few pilots and a few transactions happening. Sweden is one of the countries that is leading us globally on this. But there are still a lot of questions that we are asking around biodiversity credits. So the first one is, despite this definition of credits, for example, there is not a clear taxonomy around this market. We, for example, are still a little bit confused by the word credit, by the word certificate. Are we talking about just biodiversity? Are we talking about nature? We know, for example, that there is not a clear relationship with other type of credits, which, by the way, are being developed in all the sustainability spaces, from carbon that was already existent to water, plastic, resilience credits. So what is the different relation? How are we looking at different type of credits? And what are they nature specific or just like biodiversity, which will make a difference for when buyers and investors will look into this market. The second element that has to be put up front is integrity. So how do we basically ensure that the market develops with high integrity, that we respect the right of indigenous peoples and all of that? We still miss a global architecture of governance that can support this. In the past COP15 in Montreal, we produced 19 principles for consultation on integrity, and they all touched on both elements that we know, for example, from experiences of carbon market and conservation restoration projects. And we're talking about being very transparent, data being open sourced and accessed, to elements more directly related to additionality. So it's like the likes of the carbon market, the classic additionality, the leakage of negative outcomes in closed ecosystems or closed areas to the projects, permanence and durability. So how do we ensure that these credits stay in the long run, the outcome, positive outcomes stay in the long run on biodiversity? And eventually the biggest part, the most important part, and this is where it's important to stress that biodiversity credits need to provide outcomes for basically nature positive, net zero and socially equitable futures, is the social aspect. So biodiversity credits cannot be linked to the social aspect. And we know that we need to not only use free, prior, and informed consent or benefit sharing, but we need to involve the indigenous people and local of the principles from the design of these credits and of these projects. We need to ensure that they can decide whether they want to act or not, so that they are empowered to make decisions for themselves. And this is a very important point that is being stressed more and more also in those indigenous communities and indigenous people groups. The other debate that is currently ongoing is on metrics and measurement. How from companies, when I talk to them, is what am I buying into? What are we talking about of the unit? We know that from the carbon, it's very easy because 1 ton of CO2 is applicable everywhere. But when we look at the biodiversity and nature, it's not easy. We need to embrace the complexity of this. And we know that there is not a single metrics or a single way or indicator that can tell us across biomes, across ecosystems and geographies, switching nature. What we're doing now, working also with the Biodiversity Credits Alliance, is trying to create a little bit more clarity there. We are trying to understand what metrics stands at the foundation of some of this work, and we need to be mindful that the question of metrics is pinpointing all the question on nature finance and transition to sustainability of nature until we are able to measure and to compare somehow the different indicators and the different metrics. It will be different from companies, for investors, from even the projects to report clearly on what they are doing. And so the question of metrics is a very important one. So what we're doing now, for example, is trying to understand not only which metrics projects are using, and we're doing this to support and build a little bit of trust for buyers to start moving and testing. Not only what the metrics are used right now by pilots all over the world, so what are some of the indicators and metrics that they are using? We're mapping them against TNFD, SPTNs, all the indicators, all the targets that can be that are currently being set. But we're also trying to understand, for example, are we measuring only inputs or outputs of biodiversity when we talk about biodiversity credits? Are we talking, what kind of precision are we looking at? Are we looking at only composite metrics, or are we looking also at proxies? Basically, I don't know, predators, for example, that can give us an understanding of what's happening into the wider ecosystems. And what kind of baseline, for example. So we're trying to understand what metrics are currently being measured and creating a little bit some categories of these metrics, because we are not going to reach a single unit that can help us. And eventually, we aim to connect all of this work with other organizations, such as the Natur-positive initiative that is trying to coordinate this global effort on metrics. Lastly, all our work evolves around the last challenge that I want to mention, which is the lack of the business case. We know that usually when there's a new market, there's a competitive advantage for first movers to start and test into new markets. While for biodiversity credit, it's a little bit different. And part is due to the other challenges I mentioned. Part is also due to the reputational issues that are emerging from, for example, the carbon side. So we need to understand and unpack a little bit more what are the drivers of demand, for example. And we've identified last year, working with corporates, a few drivers why corporate would buy, what is the main drive for them to get into the market. And we know that there might be internal, such as being mission driven, contributing to the global biodiversity framework as a whole, or, for example, still in the internal side of the drivers is the access to ecosystem services, which is, in my opinion, a very important. So I was mentioning that everything that we do at the World Economic Forum eventually is anchored around the question on the business case. How do we create this business case? And so there might be different drivers of demand. And sorry if I already mentioned some of them, I don't know where, so I'll start again on this slide. So there are the more internal drivers, starting from being mission oriented to looking at your dependencies and your ecosystem services and the one that you depend on, and access those ecosystem services through the use of biodiversity credits, which in my opinion will be a big drivers for some sectors in this space. And then we have the more external drivers, so the regulatory issues. We know, for example, the UK the Australia nature repair market, UK uplift, biodiversity uplift policy. So they are all either on the compliance side or on the voluntary side. They are all regulating this market somehow, and I think more and more regulation are coming as we progress. Then there is, of course, drivers of differentiating your business vis-a-vis a competitor. There is the double-edged sword, as I mentioned, of the reputational issue. And of course, there is also for some companies, some specific companies, there's also the access to finance, which could be relevant in some circumstances, specifically for those smaller companies that are looking for more investment. So there, I mentioned before that there is a lack, basically, of a competitive advantage for the first mover. So we need to clarify for company and support them in this journey. I also want to finish saying that we need to create better clarity around the use cases. So how can company use these credits for in different circumstances? Last year, when we produced this work on the drivers, we also worked on the use cases. And what we saw and what we identified in the market were 4 accepted use cases plus 1 that was contested. So the 4 are the classic one, the ones that basically you would also look when you look at carbon. So it's either supporting your strategy on nature, supporting your strategy even on climate. So strengthening your climate targets. We also have, as mentioned, directly related to the driver, the access to ecosystem services. And so you can claim the purchase of credits on accessing a few key ecosystem services that nature provides, and reporting that against some of the targets that you might have in your strategies. There is, of course, the bundling with products and all the other use cases, but I want to also put the accent on the last one, the plus one, which is the contested, which is the compensation. For now, we've identified it not as a use case that can be used in the voluntary space. And the reason is a clear lack of architecture and governance around this that would make compensation also voluntarily as feasible. And we know that there are few issues around that with offsets. So we need to continue this conversation, understand what is missing, because this is a potential use case that could unlock big numbers in the market, of course, but we need to be very mindful on how we do that and mindful of greenwashing. Finally, just to mention that I mentioned that all our work is basically trying to see how we can create this better business case. So we're working with business to understand, for example, what are the necessary steps. We're creating this roadmap, which we hope to publish the next COP in Cali. What are the necessary steps from setting your nature strategy to understand what to measure? So basically binding all the things that I mentioned together. How can we create more clarity? How can we support business to start moving? And I want to end on this note on this encouragement of act now for everyone, understanding our impacts and where our dependencies are, what are our risks and what are our opportunities. We need to start somehow this transition process. And there's also overburden possibly for all the reporting frameworks and all of that. But we need to start moving, and we need to test and make the mistakes so that we can improve. And we need to accept that mistakes will be made in this space of nature. We don't have a magic wand just to make everything perfect from the get-go. We cannot wait the 20 years that took the carbon markets to be set up. So we need to start moving and testing, because I think that the biggest mistake that we can make from our action is not to do any action at all. So thanks again, and happy to answer a few questions.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. You get warm applause from Grane in Västerbotten. I'm also happy when you came back to us. So we have time for a few questions. So if you just, you online participants, please send them to us. And are there any questions in the room here? I have a question while you're thinking about it. You were talking about the lack of business cases. What first movers can you see? when it comes to biocredits and biocredits markets?
That's a perfect question, Malin. Thanks for that. I think I will not name directly the people that we're working with, because I don't want to highlight one against the other, but I would speak about sectors, because I think, as mentioned, we need to anchor these around sector transition, around transition to more nature positive business model. And the sectors that I see that are starting to move, that are the most interested one, are not surprisingly the one that have the biggest impact and dependencies on nature. And they are the ones that are more dependent, even though maybe they might have the biggest impact. They are the ones that want to act now, because they know that their impact is also proportional to to how much they depend on nature. And those are sectors, for example, in oil and gas, mining sector, energy sector, and all of them, they are already starting moving to understand how can they do better. And the clear line between a buyers and a suppliers sometimes is blurred with biodiversity, because some of these companies might have a lot of land that they are interested in using and exploring and partnering with project developers to safeguard. But the clear answer that biodiversity credit can provide is methodologies to understand what is the uplift, how is the positive outcomes, and it gives them this push to use something that is comparable with across different geographies and across different ecosystems as well.
Thank you. We have a question from Swedbank.
Yes, hi. Thank you, Alessandro, for a very good presentation. Speaking of the demand side, then, I was wondering whether, apart from the private actors and potential investors on the financial industry and maybe in the corporate sector, would you also consider public actors? Do you have some sort of considerations around that? Meaning like states or municipalities who might have their own strategies.
Yes, so definitely, I think, as mentioned, I think the line between the buyers and the suppliers is blurred. What I've heard different opinions on that. I think some of the public sector can definitely be a buyer, especially when supporting these sort of pilots, when supporting this market to be kickstarted, so that then the private sector can have the trust to continue working. I definitely think that there is a big role for MDBs, for development finance institution at this early stage of the market to be the sort of like the demand drivers, actors of this, and supporting a little bit and pushing the demand up. At the same time, in some of the discussion I've had with some, for example, city officials in a few cities in Africa, they are also looking at how can they partner with some of the biodiversity credits developer or methodology developer, standard setter, to use some of the land they have, and that they would like to preserve and continue to use those methodologies. And since often, especially when it comes, for example, and this is just an example in cities, the budget of cities is often limited. And how can they use these methodologies to provide basically new opportunities for this project to happen and to be sold on the market to other private actors? So I'm sorry, my answer is not a straight yes or no. And it's just because as we move in this space, as we navigate this space, there is always some new opportunities, some new thing that emerge. And I'm hopeful that some of this answer will be provided also through testing and through piloting and through more discussions in this space. So that's where I think that acting now will benefit everyone in this market.
Thank you very much. And since time is running out, I would like you to quite briefly what would be your recommendations to the people and organizations in Sweden that are working with this biocredits market? What would be the most important things that you would like to give them from your perspective? Short.
Thanks, Malin. And yes, as mentioned, I think act now. Look at your nature strategy, look at setting up nature strategy, look at understanding your dependencies, set target for nature. There is a lot of happening. Business for Nature is one of the organizations that is now compiling a lot of different nature strategies. Start from that. This is the first step of the roadmap that we're building. Start there, because it will help you understand where you want to operate, how you want to operate, and all of that. So this is my first recommendation. And then keep engaging with all different actors in the space. Keep contributing, because we need everyone, an approach where everyone is supporting and contributing to this space. As we're almost build the plane as we fly. That's how I like to think about it.
Thank you very much for contributing to our program today. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, and wishing everyone a good continuation.